I know you're down in Washington for this Aspen Economic Strategy Group meeting, really talking about the status of the CHIPS Act at this point. You can bring us up to date. How much money has actually been dispersed as opposed to authorized? And how much of it is in grants? How much of it's in loans?
Well, the CHIPS Act authorized around $39 billion in incentives for the government to disperse to chip makers for building new chip making facilities. And around 80% of the funds, mostly in grants, but some loans as well, have been given out to over half a dozen companies, largely companies manufacturing chips, but also beginning to issue some grants to companies that produce some of the materials that are necessary in chip manufacturing, with the goal of building up the entire supply chain needed for making semiconductors in the United States.
And let's talk about how meaningful this is in terms of the long-term trajectory of the U.S. chip industry. There was a really interesting Wall Street Journal article out over the weekend that took a look at this Boston Consulting Group study. It was commissioned by the Semiconductor Industry Association, but it found that the project, it should help boost the U.S. share of the global chip production industry to about 14% in 2032. Without that, actually, the U.S. share would have fallen to about 8%. When you think about the global scale, what is the share that the U.S. could reasonably get to with the help of this program?
Well, I think the study that you cited has roughly the right numbers in it. Over the next decade, we're going to see a meaningful increase in the share of chips that are produced in the U.S. And 14% might not sound like a lot, but the U.S. consumes 25% of the world's chips. So we'll be ballpark 60% self-sufficient. And when you add in chips that are produced in allied countries like Japan or like Korea or like Europe, we end up seeing a really significant reduction in the share of chips that we're going to be sourcing from geopolitical hotspots. And that ultimately is the point of the CHIPS Act. It's about guaranteeing the resilience of our manufacturing base by making sure that we're sourcing chips from trustworthy locations.
Chris, there's a lot of focus on the money being put into the ground, as it were, to build the plants. You also have to have some skilled workers to operate those plants. How are we doing on that part of it?
Well, I think that has been a real challenge thus far, both in terms of the construction workforce that has some really specialized types of construction trades that are needed in building chip plants, as well as the workers who will eventually staff the facilities when they're up and running. And in both segments, we've seen challenges. But I think if you look at the programs that are underway right now, companies partnering with universities, for example, or community colleges to train up the workers in exactly the disciplines that they need, what you find is that this is a problem that is in the process of being solved. There's always a bit of a chicken and egg with workforce. You don't have people trained in the jobs unless you've got the jobs available. And right now we're seeing companies and local governments and state governments work together to try to find a way through this issue. In the long run, I don't have any doubt that the workers will be there at the level of quality and at the price point that are needed to make these chip-making facilities operational.
Well, Chris, to that point, what role do you see immigration potentially playing when it comes to actually boosting the supply of these skilled workers?
Well, if you look at the history of the chip industry, skilled immigration has been central to U.S. technological advantages. We've been importing skilled workers, technologists, scientists from Europe and Japan and China and India for the entire history of the chip industry. And I think that ought to play a role. Obviously, the U.S. immigration system is complex. It imposes too many limits on skilled immigration, and so that does present a roadblock. But I think ultimately it's an issue that will be worked through over time.
Chris, in your book, Chip War, you talk about the geopolitics of semiconductors. And I wonder, as we talk about what we're making inside the United States, how critical is it that it be in the United States as opposed to being made at some very close allies, such as, for example, South Korea, such as Japan, over in Europe?
You know, I don't think I would differentiate too much between a chip made in the U.S. versus a chip made in Germany or Japan. But the problem is right now, they're not made in Germany or Japan. The key chips that are driving advances in artificial intelligence or powering our PCs and smartphones and data centers, the vast majority, around 90% of the most advanced chips, are made in one country, Taiwan. And so I look positively on the efforts of both our European friends, our Koreans allies, our Japanese allies to build up their own chip-making ecosystems. And if you look at the global perspective, what you find is there's a lot of countries that are building out their own chip manufacturing ecosystems. And insofar as that's adding geographic diversification, I think that's a good thing for the United States.